Good morning. Welcome to the first day of October. Amazing, huh? I've got a lot to offer you this morning. Michael and I really should have made this a week-long retreat instead of a 3-day retreat, so there's a lot here. I'd like to treat these Dharma talks like rain. It will fall on the earth, and what needs to soak in will soak in. And what needs to run off will run off, and either are okay. So let's soak in what soaks in, and let run off what runs off. Now, yesterday we talked about the obstacles to our happiness. I have a question for you to start. What is the biggest obstacle to your happiness? Can I answer it for you?
Ego.
You, right? You are the biggest obstacle to your own happiness. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is how that process starts and how it grows and how we can practice with that. I'm going to present a model of our experience that's using this graphic that Alan passed out for us. I'm going to return to that again and again. I'm hoping this model will be something that you can use and internalize and use it as a way to understand what's going on here. I call it the three-ring circus, this model, because it's sort of what goes on for us. So if we take a look at it, take a look at the first page here, the circles of suffering. That's what we're going to spend about 90% of our time on today. You'll notice there's 3 circles. Core suffering is in the middle. Self is in the next ring out. And then the world is the farthest ring out from that. So I'm going to start talking about the core. I'm going to work my way out. Core suffering. What is core suffering? Core suffering is the inner pain that we do not want to feel. We do not want to feel. In fact, we don't want to feel it so much that we don't even know it's there. It's kind of like, if you think about the earth and the earth has a molten core, our core suffering is like our molten core. It's so dangerous that we don't want to touch it. But there it is, living in us. And when we do touch it, it's so powerful that we feel like it's life-threatening. The first time I touched my core suffering, it was a physical experience so intense that I thought it might be able to kill me. It's really different from, I don't like this. It's like, boo, really strong, really strong. And the fact that you have core suffering doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. None of us escapes this. So I'm going to speak in real generalizations here, and it doesn't apply in all cases to everyone, but please take the generalization as a kind of a guide that might apply to you. So how does this core suffering arise? Now here's a theory. So when we are in our mother's womb, we have more or less a perfect environment. We don't get hungry. We don't get cold. Everything we need is provided for us. And this doesn't happen for everyone, but for most of us, it was like that. And then we're born into this imperfect world. No matter how much our parents love us, no matter how much our environment is beautiful and wonderful, we will come across the imperfections of the world. We won't get our needs met in the same way we got our needs met when we were in utero, in this perfect environment. And because we are children when this happens, we don't know how to deal with this creatively or wisely like we would as an adult. And we believe it's our fault that this happens. Yeah. So this doesn't just happen as an infant, this happens as we're growing up too. So I just want to give some examples of what I mean by this. So this is drawing from someone's life I know quite intimately. So we encounter that external problem of being born into an imperfect world. In my case, I encountered this external problem of my dad thought I was too sensitive. Right? So that's the external problem. And so I developed this internal belief that says I'm defective. Because of course, I'm a child and I think everything is my fault. We are self-centered in the way our minds work as a child. So when my dad says I'm too sensitive, I think, oh, I'm defective. Or how about this one? My family wanted me to be a cowboy. My dad's family comes from Montana ranching family, and being a cowboy is a really good thing to that part of my family. Well, I was not at all interested in being a cowboy. I was afraid of horses. I had no interest in raising cows and killing them to eat them. So I had this external problem when my family wanted me to be a cowboy, but I had no interest in being a cowboy. So what did I do? I became ashamed of who I was. It's my fault. I'm not good enough to be a cowboy. So my core suffering was fed by those experiences and other experiences. So there's two important facts about core suffering that I want to make. And I hope this is something that soaks in. So two facts here. The first fact is that we have core suffering is true. Right? All of us have it. That is true. But the facts about our core suffering are not true. They are false. The ideas I have that created my core suffering are my false ideas. So it's true that I have this experience, but what gave rise to it is a false understanding of what happened. So for instance, how does that work? In the first example of my family thinks I'm too sensitive, or my father thinks I'm too sensitive. So it's true that they think I'm too sensitive, but the fact is I'm fine just the way I am. Right? Being sensitive is actually a superpower. It's made me a really great chaplain. I can go into a room with a dying person and I can feel what they're feeling because I'm very sensitive. So I internalized a false idea about me that I'm too sensitive as my core suffering. Well, that's one example. How about the cowboy example? So it's true that I feel shame because I didn't measure up to being a cowboy. But it's false that I wanted to be a cowboy or I should have been a cowboy. There's nothing to be ashamed about. I'm fine just the way I am. The world didn't need me to be a cowboy. Yet somehow I turned that fact that I'm not a cowboy into shame. Our core suffering is ultimately not about us. It's about the conditions of our lives and our false reading of those. It's not about us. We are just fine as we are. We are just fine. But all we could do as a child was blame ourselves. And that's where we got stuck. So I hope we can hold those two facts together, that we actually have this core suffering, but in reality there's nothing wrong with us. Nothing at all. So we don't have to be embarrassed or afraid of our core suffering, and we don't have to believe it either. I'll talk a little later about how to practice with that. So let's move out to the next circle, this self circle. Now, I mentioned that when I first touched my core suffering, it was so powerful it felt life-threatening. And we do not want to feel that kind of suffering. So we develop a set of beliefs and behaviors that are what we think of as our self. And that's this middle circle. It's a set of beliefs and behaviors that are designed to keep us from feeling that core suffering. So what are those kind of things? So you might grow a self that says, I'm quiet, or I'm extroverted. Or maybe you say, I love people, or I'm a hermit. Mike and I grew those. Guess which one's which? Some of us grow a set of beliefs and behaviors that say, I'm going to deal with the world by being angry. I'm going to strike first before anybody can get to me. Or some of us make ourselves so small that we don't have the opportunity for people to bring up our core suffering. We hide. None of these are right or wrong, but we all develop these beliefs and behaviors, and this is what this self circle is made up of. So in my case, again, my self circle is to prevent me from feeling shame, which is really one of my strong core suffering elements, shame. So I don't want to, for instance, feel the shame of being rejected. So what do? I please people. Or I don't want to feel the shame of not doing something well, being criticized for that. So what do? I become a perfectionist. I make sure I do it all right, so there's no room for criticism, and my shame doesn't get touched. I don't want the shame of being unprepared, so what do? I plan. And these are generalizations because I don't always act in this way. And I'm not always just compulsively doing these things. But if I really look carefully, these elements are there. These elements are there. And then from that, we go out to the third circle, the world circle. And it's the largest circle. It represents everything that we encounter. People or objects, ideas. And it's any sort of contact between you and not you. Our self circle really wants the world circle to be an ally in making sure that our core suffering is not touched. So we go around with our self circle, these beliefs and behaviors that we use to keep our core suffering at bay, and we say, you do that too. You keep that at bay for me. Don't you dare touch my core suffering. So we're always trying to control the world circle. And boy, is that a lot of work. Whew. Is that a lot of work? Michael talked about this yesterday, about this interaction between ourself and the world. So I'm not going to say a whole lot about that. But I just want to really make the point that our self, our set of beliefs and behaviors, is trying to enforce upon the world that you need to also be part of my project here. Here's an example for me. I notice that when I drive, I'm very judgmental. I am criticizing people for doing anything. Didn't turn on your signal. Didn't turn off your signal. Turned on your signal too soon. Turned on your signal too late. Going too slow. Going too fast. I can find infinite reasons to criticize other people. And I wondered about this for a long time, and then I finally realized, oh, I am trying to force the world to be an ally, not to touch my core shame. Because the way I don't touch my core shame is I try and do it right. And so I try and drive in such a way that I do it right. And then I see you doing it different than that and getting away with it. Ooh, there comes my judgment, right? So I'm going to try and use my judgment to force you to do it right as well. So that's an example of how we're always trying to make the world an ally and not touching our core suffering. Okay, so that's the basic introduction to these three circles. And the question then becomes, how do we practice with that? It's okay, we know about it, but what do we do with this? Well, like I said, we're often looking to the world circle to solve our core suffering problem. If only the world wouldn't do that, I wouldn't suffer. But that's not a bargain we can win. Although I do want to honor that to some extent, it is true that the world will make us suffer. For instance, if you're persecuted, if you're assaulted, the world is making you suffer. And I don't want to excuse any of those things because they're real. Oppression is real. Prejudice is real. But there's a lot we can do without having to just depend on the world to change for us. So when I asked that question earlier about what's your biggest obstacle to happiness, usually we think it's the world. But I'd like to suggest it's actually the two inner circles. It's our self and it's our core suffering. That is actually our biggest obstacle to happiness. And we can't do much about the outside world. As you know, you can push really hard against the outside world, but not to much effect oftentimes. And you also can't do much about your core suffering directly because it's so hidden. So in practice, we start with looking at that circle of self. That's where we begin. And really that's what Zen practice is all about. It's about looking at those two inner circles. It's kind of fun that oftentimes we show up to Zen practice with the idea that we're going to get enlightened and that we're going to all of a sudden be this really great Buddha and that the world circle is going to see that and leave us the heck alone and honor us so we never have to touch our suffering. That idea fades after a while, and what we really see is that Zen, the practice of Zen, is the practice of bearing witness to those two inner circles, doing the hard work of being willing to feel what's going on here. And we turn our attention away from the outside world needing to validate or make it easy for us. Ultimately, when we practice this way in our Zen practice, what we're really doing is transforming our suffering into love. So it's really great that we have this suffering because it's the fuel that becomes compassion later. Okay, so whether we like it or not, we have to practice with our circle of self, which is the beliefs and behaviors that we have accumulated not to feel our core suffering. That's where we start. The irony is that circle of self, all those beliefs and behaviors, are really obvious to everybody else but us. Right? Like Mike and I say that we've known people really intimately by sitting in silence together. Even there, we can see each other's circle of self so clearly. But to us, it's really hard to see. Really hard to see. So there's lots of practices that we can use to begin to see that set of beliefs and behaviors we call me. And we could talk about a number of them, but I want to focus on just one of those practices today. And this is a practice that we've learned from Joko Beck, who I really love the work that she's done around this. So in order to begin to see the beliefs and behaviors that I've used to create me, what I do is I begin to label my thoughts. So let's try this for a second. Let's actually make this a practice. So find your posture. I'll just talk you through the practice sort of in real time. Begin to settle yourself, letting go, letting go, letting go. And bringing your attention back to your anchor, the anchor of your breathing. This settling and anchoring is called clearing the listening space. We clear the listening space so that there's room to see what arises. As your listening space clears, begin to notice the thoughts that arise from that clear space. And as a thought arises, give it a simple label. It might be planning. It might be, rumination. So it's good to find a label for your thoughts that's not too specific. For instance, ruminating about what my third grade teacher said to me when I wore those red pants. That's not so useful. But also not so general that you don't know what it is. So you wouldn't say something too general about your rumination, and you wouldn't just label it thinking. Something useful for you. So this is what we do on the cushion. We clear this listening space and we label the thoughts that arise again and again and again. So you can open your eyes. Now, this seems like really boring work, right? I mean, it's like, who wants to sit there and label your thoughts? But actually, when we do this hour after hour, day after day, month after month, we begin to see patterns that arise. And what is obvious to others begins to become obvious to you. What they know about you, you begin to know about you. You get a clear idea about the thoughts and behaviors that make up that self circle, because you've been labeling them diligently and looking for eventually the patterns of those things. So I'll again talk about me because I know myself fairly intimately, and in this process for me, I began to see that I had thoughts and urges to behavior that fell into 4 basic categories. One of them was planning. I'd sit on the cushion and the plans came up. Yeah, I build furniture, and so planning designs of furniture. Boy, that came up again and again and again. The second one that I noticed coming up was I was revising the past so I looked better. Right? These things that I had done in the past, I was replaying them and subtly shifting it every time so that I actually looked a lot better than in reality I behaved. Well, that happened again and again. The third one was, I found I was explaining myself to someone who wasn't there. Somebody I'd had some interaction with, and I was still having an interaction with them, but they weren't there. But I was still trying to make it work out my way. And then the fourth one that came up a lot for me was ruminating over past hurts. This person did that in the past, and boy, was that unfair. Man, I wished she hadn't done that. I wish I'd said this instead, and I wish, ruminate. So of course, your thoughts will be different than mine. That's just the ones I have created not to touch my core suffering. But what that did for me was to start giving me insight into what actually is part of my core suffering, because I saw that those 4 kinds of thoughts that I had again and again and again and again were all about shame. I had no idea that there was shame as my core suffering until I started to look at the kinds of thoughts that I was generating compulsively. All of those thoughts were to protect me from that shame. I don't think that we can usually see our core suffering directly, at least at first. So we have to look to its effect on ourself. I kind of think of this as like a black hole. You can't see a black hole. It doesn't emit any light. But what you can see is its effect on the stars and the galaxy around it. And by that, infer something about the black hole. And I think it's the same about our core suffering. We have to look at its effect on the galaxy of thoughts around us so that we can begin to have a sense of what our core suffering actually is. Well, we can actually get to know our core suffering directly after some time, but it takes a while. And when we label our thoughts like I've been suggesting we do, our core suffering starts to become more and more illuminated, and we begin to be able to work with it rather than have it work on us. Usually it's working on us in unconscious ways, in compulsive ways, in automatic reactions to things. But the more we begin to become aware of it, the more we have choice. And we're not simply just compulsively acting from our core suffering. We can notice that it's up. And this is a stage that Michael and I are really with these days. We're having more and more revelations about, oh, I just did that because of this core suffering. And we see it and we think, oh, yes, I see that. I'm not just a victim of my compulsions. So in order to practice with directly touching our core suffering, we have to practice in a counterintuitive way. Our habit energy is to flee it. We don't want nothing to do with it. We don't want to even know it exists. Right? But counterintuitively, our practice is to lean into it, to bear witness to it. And bearing witness, I really love that term because it has a real connotation of what this practice is. To bear something is to be willing to feel it. You can witness something without bearing it. You can see something you don't really care about and not bear it in some way. So, for instance, if you like to watch sports on TV and you watch a game between 2 teams you don't care about, you can witness that game, but there's nothing that you bear in that. But if you watch a game with your team and they're losing, you're bearing witness, right? You're agreeing to open yourself up saying, I want that, and you're not getting that, and you're bearing witness, you're feeling it. It's like that with our core suffering. We have to bear witness to it. But this is not a trivial experience. To bear witness to our core suffering takes an enormous amount of bravery. Because when we touch those core suffering sensations, they can be very strong and they can be very scary. The first time I touched my core suffering of fear and of shame that was so strong that I had thoughts that I might not survive. My fear core suffering flashed as a memory of my early childhood, a memory of receiving violence. And I didn't know I could feel fear like that. I had no idea. It just swept over my body. When I touched my core shame, I woke up in the middle of the night. I'd had a dream in which I felt shamed. And I woke up and it felt like my guts were in a Cuisinart. Like I might not live through this. But by that time, I'd been practicing this way enough that I thought, oh, I'm going to stick with this. And I lay there for about a half an hour with the intention of just to feel it. That was a real gift that I gave myself. To feel it. So this is the practice. And the wonderful part about it is that's all we need to do. To feel is to transform. We could think about this as a continuum. Usually what we do with things we don't like is we either flee them, we run away, or we feed them. We give them more and more energy in the hope that we might be able to think our way out of it. That's the rumination side. So you either flee it or feed it, but the middle way here is to feel it. To feel it. And our willingness to feel is the medicine that we need to transform. If we find ourselves wanting to think about it, just come back to feeling it. If we find ourselves trying to run from it, come back. And I suggest that as this arises for you, that you do your best to feel it with kindness and compassion. This is strong stuff. And you have a wisdom to know how much to allow it to be present in this moment. In medicine, we talk about titration. We talk about giving just the right amount of a medication. Not too much, not too little. And that's the way we can practice with this too. Exposing ourselves just enough. Not too much, not too little. Oftentimes on retreat like this, we're able to feel it more because we have the support of the Sangha. We have the collective energy of the Sangha. We can allow ourselves to really fall apart when we feel it and know that we're held by the energy of others. Michael and I have done that for each other, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I remember times on retreat when I was suffering so deeply that all I could do was get in behind him and walk. When he put his left foot down, I put my left foot down. When he put his right foot down, I put my right foot down. It's all I could do. And then an hour later, the roles changed. Now Michael's completely immersed in that core suffering experience, and I've got the energy to hold him. So tears on the cushion, wonderful. Wonderful. When I was thinking about how powerful the medicine of awareness was, I was thinking about my great aunt Alice. So my great aunt Alice, she lived to be 106 years old. She was just an amazing person. And she moved from Hawaii to Seattle to live in a retirement home. And she brought with her a kumquat tree. Yeah, a little kumquat tree in a pot. And it wasn't doing well in Seattle. It doesn't like that environment. It wasn't growing kumquats, and it got kind of brown. So she put it in a south-facing window of her apartment in this retirement community. And the sun shone on this kumquat tree. And over time, the warm sun transformed that kumquat tree, and it started growing fruit again. So when I was a little kid, we used to love to go to Aunt Alice's apartment, and she'd let us pick a kumquat off the tree and eat this tart little thing that was like a little explosion in our mouths. And it was all because she put it in the sun, and the sun did the healing that was necessary for the kumquat tree. And I think it's like that for our core suffering. All we have to do is put it in the sunlight of our awareness, our kind awareness, our willingness to bear witness to this. And just that alone is enough to grow the fruit of the practice. And we become more and more free each time we do that. So let's turn our handout over. I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on this, but I painted a pretty tough picture here. A picture of a lot of suffering and what we do to be with that suffering. But I want to show the other side of these three circles, because they exist as well. So as our core suffering transforms, we begin to experience our true self at our core. So that's the center circle now. Our core suffering is with our true self. So the more that core suffering calms down, the more room there is for us to see our Buddha nature, our true self. And that Buddha nature doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. It is all of our Buddha nature together, our interbeing Buddha nature. It's the wisdom of the salmon coming upstream. It's the love of the mother lion for her kittens. It's at the core of all of us. It's that deep well of clarity and wisdom and compassion that exists of no fault of our own at our core. So just like from our core suffering we grew a personality, a circle of self, from our true self we have our own personal brilliance. The true self is disembodied. It doesn't have a way to express itself in the world except through us, through you and through me. And it expresses through everything differently. I can't do what you do. You have your own personal brilliance. I have mine. That's the positive side of the personality that we have. It's this thing that grows from our Buddha nature and makes us something unique in the world. Buddha nature is the love, but Buddha nature needs these hands to take loving action. Buddha nature is the compassion, but it needs these eyes and this willing heart to feel and act with that compassion in the world. That's your personal brilliance, the way you do that. And the wonderful thing about this is that just like we used our self to protect our core suffering, we use our personal brilliance to help everything and everyone in our unique way. Every cell in my body needs to function well for my whole body to function well. And every cell in the Sangha body needs to function well for the Sangha to function well. So if you squash your personal brilliance, you are impoverished, but the whole world is impoverished. None of us can do what you do. None of us sees like you see. And we need you. We absolutely need you just as you are. That's your personal brilliance. And so the outer circle, this engagement with the world, this is what the partnership between your true self and your personal brilliance does. It says, I have this love arising, and I have this skill, and this is how I'm going to engage in the world with that. For me, I remember I just loved sitting on my cushion for years and years and years. I was happy as a clam to be my hermit self and sit on my cushion. And there came a point where I suddenly felt dissatisfied with that. I felt like I need to get out there and do something. This is turning into a sort of a kind of a spiritual self-indulgence to sit here hour after hour on my cushion. So what did I do? I went down to my local hospital and said, I'd like to volunteer. I heard this thing is called a chaplain. Can I do this? And luckily, this woman that ran the chaplaincy program took a look at this guy in brown robes and said, okay. and that was the start for me to take my true self out into my own personal brilliance, because I had all these listening skills from my suffering, and I engaged in the world. And you know how to do that too. You all are doing that right now. When we look at this side, this core suffering is always about telling us why we're not enough, right? Why was something wrong with us? We have to be ashamed, we have to be afraid, whatever it is. But this side is telling us exactly the opposite. It's saying, you are enough. Just as you are enough. And even more, we love you the way you are, the rest of us. We want you to be like that. We need you to be like that. And this is what you gain when you transform your core suffering. You get to not be wrapped in the negative core that hurts, and you get to live more and more from this expression of your true self and your personal brilliance. This is the fruit of our practice. The more I practice, the more I get joy in the flowering of other people. And nothing would give me more joy than for you to be able to dwell in your own personal brilliance. That would give me so much joy. I've covered a lot. I hope that some of the rain is soaking in. And maybe some will come back later. But I just want to leave you with my profound encouragement to do this work so that you can be free to be yourself in the world. Thank you so much for your kind attention.